This is fine. It is my honor to call on the stage our panelists on why the EU matters. Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who is the Vice Chair of Atlantic Council, Software Center for Strategy and Security, former Under-Secretary of State for Global Affairs. I'll also like to invite to the stage the Honorable Joan Ryan, who is Director of ELNET-UK and who is a former Labour Member of Parliament in the British Parliament. She was a member until 2019 when she famously resigned from the Labour Party in protest of a culture of anti-Semitism. I would also like to invite Gol Kalev, who is an author and a journalist who writes regularly in the Jerusalem Post and published 2 books. One of them that you'll see on your tables, which we're giving to everyone who's here today, and we're having a book signing at 3:15 p.m. with Gol Kalev, and at 5 p.m. if you want to get your book signed by the author who's on stage with us at 3:15, and at 5 p.m. he will be signing some books in the back hallway on the right. Thank you, and please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Palm Beach community for hosting this such crucially important event. I'm deeply honored to be with both of you, the Right Honorable Ryan and an ambassador. It's great to be here, and thank you for choosing my book for the conference. I'm getting books for everybody, and I look forward to the book signing, which is very relevant to this panel. I'm arguing in the book and in my column and articles that we're in the midst of a fast-moving attempt to eradicate Judaism that is coming from the West. There's an attempt to negate the idea of the Jewish state through, and therefore negate the idea of Judaism. And I'm showing how that is a national security threat to the United States. And much of that, sadly, is coming from Europe. And that's not new. That's been going on for 2,300 years. European opposition to Judaism has been a permanent feature of history and always followed the most relevant aspect of Judaism at that time. In our time, it's a Jewish state. So that's no surprise. And Michael, I liked very much what you said earlier, that rather than talking about the problem or celebrating the problem, this is the conference about countering anti-Semitism. And as you know, I view a lot of what we're going to speak about throughout the day, what's happening on campuses, and media bias and things like that, as symptoms of the greater issue, which is the attempt to negate the idea of the Jewish state and through it to negate the idea of Judaism. So I would love to start by offering 2 actionable, specific suggestions, as you suggested, that could be implemented by the administration. We're here just a few steps away from the Winter White House, and we have a lot of people here in this room who have various touch points with that, and we had Morgan from the administration just speak to us. So with your permission, I would love to kind of throw in 2 ideas that I've written about in my column and developed, and they're also in the book, and get your reactions. The first is relating to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and lawfare in general. And I think what happened over the last few months with the ICC is misunderstood, because the headline on most people view it as, fine, the ICC have issued an arrest warrants against the leaders of the Jewish state, against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. And I think by now most people recognize that that's just, the tip of the iceberg. They've also made clear that those alleged, slanderous accusations of war crimes were not done alone. Deliberate starvations of Palestinians and all that kind of stuff were done by basically the entire military. So basically they're laying the groundwork in conjunction with the ICJ, International Court of Justice, and others for the mass arrest of all Israeli soldiers and those who support them. In short, all of the Jews, once again, just as they've done from Europe merely 80 years ago. So people maybe understand that, but it goes much farther than this, because it creates, a mechanism in one of the vectors in the attempted destruction of Judaism that I've spoke about, because it leads to demoralization. It leads to trying to instill Jewish insecurity, because if you're a mother and you have a soldier, fighting in Gaza, you might not only have a very short window to send him a text message when he's on a break and you want to say, fight hard, go get them, kill them all. Oh, wait, you can't say kill them all. You can't say that because you're not just fighting Hamas. There is some European in The Hague and in various European capitals, and there's some journalists looking at you just said, try to kill them all, crime against humanity. You're trying to murder, that including children. And this is not theoretical. When the ICJ have laid out their modern day blood libels a few months ago, they quoted text messages and posts privately that were sent by Israelis to one another. So there is a very large attempt by the International Criminal Court that goes at the heart of negating the mere existence of the Jewish state and through it of Judaism. And that also represents a threat to the United States, as Secretary Rubio said in his confirmation hearing. This is a practice run against the United States. And as I said in a recent Wall Street Journal article, this is an attempt to challenge the US-led world order, because the United States can come up to, when they have discussions with European leaders, President Trump can say, well, you need us because we have military might and economic might that protects you. But now Europeans can say, well, you need us because we have this new thing called legal might, and we can arrest you or your soldiers or your former presidents or your former politicians. So the first suggestions, I would love to hear your reactions, is as the Trump administration is set to engage in bilateral discussions with European leaders and discussions with the EU and others, is to get a pledge, an enforceable pledge from European countries that they will never agree to collaborate with the ICC or any type of lawfare. And that is important because the biggest headline for me of the last few months of the ICC was not what I just described that happened in the ICC. It's the European countries' reactions. I would expect France and Norway and others, as soon as there's once again, only 80 years later, somebody's trying to put the groundwork for the mass arrest of Jews, they'll say, no, this is horrible. We're condemning it. We're going to defund you. We're going to kick you out of the Netherlands. But they said the opposite. Sure, if there's arrest warrants against the Jews, the law is the law, and we will comply exactly as we've done 80 years ago. So getting an enforceable pledge that will stand the test of time, because it's not just the ICC, it could be individual countries. Spain could arrest an American soldier because, maybe somebody got killed in Iraq or Afghanistan was a Spanish citizen. So that's the first kind of suggestion, and I would love to, when you guys make your comments, I would love to hear your reactions. And the second one is maybe a little bit more provocative, is about Europe in general. Because if you look at the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a lot of that has been not just created by Europe, but has been maintained by Europe. Europe is funding the so-called conflict industry. These are NGOs as well as direct EU programs and UN programs that incite Palestinians against Israelis. And I know them because some of those people in the conflict industries are my friends. And we have honest conversations in Jerusalem. They throw great parties and they do great stuff there. But Europe should have no involvement whatsoever in Israeli-Palestinian affairs, because Europe has nurtured the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And if we want to move forward to peace, we need to remove this hurdle of European involvement. There is no European interest in this conflict. There's other European interest, economics and stuff like that, but in maintaining the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's no European interest. So, there's human rights interest. Well, we have human rights interest in France also. I mean, the images of French police, armed French police approaching a Muslim woman and ordering her to take her top off, is a gross violation of human rights, protected by the French government. And we in Israel, have a lot of Muslim citizens, women wearing hijab, and Orthodox Jewish women. So that's the reason. But we shouldn't be doing that relative to France. And France should not be engaging, inciting, funding the war of Palestine or inciting Palestinians against Israel. So these are the two, and this is a very opportune time because there's a new administration, there's a new dialogue between the United States and Europe that includes a lot of elements, from NATO contribution to Greenland to trade. I'm suggesting that those two elements should be high on the list. Number one, to get a pledge from individual European countries, maybe enforceable by the EU, that you would never and cannot, engage in any type of lawfare against the Jewish state of the United States. And the second, for Europe to disengage from Israeli-Palestinian affairs, so there can be new peace frameworks that we can put forward. So I would love to hear. I know it's a lot. Anyway, would you like to start?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity today. Thank you to Rabbi Shana and the Palm Beach Synagogue. I'm really pleased to be here with you, and I really appreciate this conference, and we need many more. That's absolutely clear. I think I'm kind of in the hot seat, aren't I, because I'm seen as the European here. I'm very proud to be British, and although the UK is not part of the EU, it is part of Europe. We didn't leave the continent. That actually is not possible. And so I would reframe this as UK, Europe, as opposed to EU. But I wanted to start by saying Europe isn't some great big monolith, some single country that all operates in exactly the same way. It's 40 plus countries, around about 44. 27 are in the EU, and the rest are not. And believe you me, you've got a lot of friends in Europe. Israel's got a lot of friends in Europe. You shouldn't just write it off. We have to be very careful here, because we know, certainly over the past 70, 80 years, the strategic alliance across much of Europe, America, and Israel since 1948 has been a really successful strategic alliance and very important. Now, for Israel, most of its trade is not with the US. The US is not Israel's market. Europe is. And this is a two-way street. We share the same values. We share the same kind of democracies. And it's those values and those democracies that are under attack. I don't believe you can just walk away from Europe. And when it comes to the ICC and the ICJ, just to take it back to Gol's point, I don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. I don't agree with the measures that the ICC and the ICJ have taken and enunciated in relation to Israel. I think they're wrong. And I was very disappointed that the UK government supported them. I think they're wrong in doing that. However, it's not that we don't need an ICC and an ICJ. I think we do. We do see war crimes happening. We do see breaches of human rights that are completely unacceptable in parts of the world. And there does have to be some way of dealing with those issues and holding people to account, as we saw in Kosovo, as we saw in Kosovo, Serbia, Sarajevo. Those situations, there has to be some way to hold people to account. And of course, that holding to account, the biggest example of that was Nuremberg. And thank goodness that happened. So I don't think we don't need them, but I think they've become corrupted. So how do we deal with that? Lawfare, yes, you're right, Gol. Lawfare is happening, and it's completely unacceptable to use the law in that way. But I don't think the way to deal with it is to cancel something or to say Europe can have no role, because Europe and Israel have a very, very strong relationship. If we just took Europe and the UK, after the US, the UK is Israel's most important strategic ally, and beyond that, it's UK EU. Now, between the UK and Israel, besides the trade, I mean, prescriptions in the UK for medical prescriptions, 1 in 5 is from Teva, is Israel. In each country, around 35 to 40,000 jobs depend on the trade between Israel and the UK. We cooperate on counter-terrorism. 22 plots on the streets of the UK. Iran, a state actor behind them. These have been resolved without resulting in somebody dying because of the cooperation between Israel and the UK. Cybersecurity is another huge area we cooperate on, and that is really crucially important because it's China that's winning the cybersecurity race. Israel and the UK have got a very important role. They do a huge amount of research, but in a very niche set of areas. And they need to work together, and they do. And I think the Jewish community across Europe would be very concerned at the idea that Europe should have no say in the future of Israel, because they view Israel as their home too. It's their second home, and if something terrible should happen, they like to think it would be there for them as their first home. And there's no reason why they shouldn't hold that belief. Right across Europe, we see countries such as Germany cooperating with Israel. They've bought the Arrow 3, the whole missile defence system. ELNET, the organisation I work for, European Leadership Network, our mission statement is to strengthen relations between Europe and Israel based on shared democratic values and strategic interests. And I think that is a really important statement. And we have offices across 6 European countries, and we work in something like 25 European countries. And if you look at Eastern Europe, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, Poland, they are all terrified of Russia. And they all know what anti-Semitism costs. They don't have very big Jewish communities, if any, because of the Holocaust. And they are friends of Israel. And that's really important. So I think we can reform these organisations. I think Europe does have a really important role to play. And before I hand over to the ambassador here, let me just say this. What's the bottom line? It's that strategic relationship. What's the greatest example we've just seen recently of that? When those missiles came over from Iran and from Yemen and the Houthis, who put the planes in the air? It was UK, it was France, it was US, and it was Israel. We didn't in Europe just say Israel has the right to defend itself. We were there doing that defence with Israel, and that's what strategic allies do. We need Israel, Europe needs Israel, and Israel needs Europe. I believe America needs Europe, and Europe needs Israel. And that relationship that's been so special between the UK and the US for so many years, that needs to stay a very special relationship. That's a really important relationship and has tremendous support in the UK. So we live in very troubled times. I know the Chinese proverb says you may hope you live in interesting times. I think by that they mean, I think it's ironic, I think it means troubled times. Well, I think you could say we do live in very interesting times. I think we have more that unites us than divides us. I think we have more reason than ever to work together. I think the words that were quoted before from Golda Meir about what we achieve as a collective are true. I know that from 17 years as a member of the British Parliament, 6 years serving in Tony Blair's government. I know that what happens in legislators, very few people are out there like a Tony Blair or a Donald Trump. The vast majority of politicians, what you achieve as a team. And I want that team, that alliance that I've talked about, to remain strong. Yes, let's use the full power of the law. Let's use education. Let's seek the kind of change that we need to counter the poison of anti-Semitism. And anti-Zionist anti-Semitism is just the latest iteration in that centuries-old hatred. We've got to stand up to it. When people keep saying decolonize and globalize the intifada, let's say to them, the greatest movement, the boldest movement of decolonization in the 20th century was Zionism.
Well, good afternoon, all. First, I'd like to thank you, Rabbi Minsky, if I may, for the invitation, and also just congratulate you for bringing us all here together. I had heard that originally when you put out the invitation, we were supposed to be at a different, smaller hotel, but it was so overwhelming that here we are at the Four Seasons. So really, congratulations to you. And I also want to thank and recognize Michael and Nolan Greenwald for their leadership, for their enthusiasm and engagement in this, and the challenge that they've put to all of us as speakers to really address and bring to you what recommendations we would have as a call to action. And as you heard, Gol, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to make a few points first. But I want to recognize, by the way, the parents of Michael and Nolan Greenwald. They're here in front, if I may. I've had the privilege of getting to know them, and just thank you for your support. I think that both of your kids, they're not really kids now, but really exemplify what you are all about in terms of your leadership and values. So thank you. I want to begin with just a few data points because in preparation for this, first I had to think when I saw who's lined up for this panel and it says why the EU matters. I thought to myself, well, none of us represent the EU here, Israel, UK, and the United States. So I thought, okay, well, how can I answer that question? You can look at it two ways. Does it really matter to this question? Or how has it mattered? But first, a few data points. I was looking at different surveys that have been conducted about anti-Semitism. And to me, the most daunting is from the Anti-Defamation League in this case. It indicates that, first of all, the figure is, at least in their last survey, about 46%. It's almost half the globe. 46% of adults harbor anti-Semitic behavior, and this is globally. Their survey is global, not just relegated to one region over another. I found that rather daunting. The panel before us was very focused on education, which I do think is an important, has an important role in an overall strategy. I underscore this because another figure from the Anti-Defamation League was that 20% had never even heard of the Holocaust. And when they really looked at this specifically, we're talking about those individuals who are 35 and under. I mean, rather significant in this day and age. And also, I know for myself, I have been horrified when I have listened to those who have been deniers of the Holocaust. And there are those who exist, and it's criminal, to say the least. I do like something that the Anti-Defamation League put forward, and this is one of my contributions up front, although I'm going to answer your challenge, as to what kind of action could be taken. I like a term that they use. They use the term that this is a global emergency. It is a global emergency. And they cite that today, in this day and age, that anti-Semitism in some localities is normalized behavior, which again is just outrageous, outrageous. So I wanted to bring this to your attention, at least in the beginning of discussing this issue and particularly focusing on Europe. Let me go to my second main point. So in really thinking about why, all right, the question, does the EU matter? I wasn't personally aware of this, but I want to put it before you. And you may know it, some of you may not know it. And let me actually ask the question. How many of you, if you raise your hand, know that in 2021, the EU actually did put out a strategy? Could you raise your hand if you actually knew that? Very few. Very few. Okay, you do know you're there. So actually, it's a significant statement. I'm going to tell you, I would also not raise my hand. I didn't know it. I was really rather shocked to see it. But they put out the first ever EU strategy. This was under the President Ursula von der Leyen. It was adopted in October of 2021. Interestingly enough, 23 out of 27 member states endorsed it. So 4 of them did not. I was trying to really find hard which 4 did not. And quite honestly, I couldn't see online which were the 4. Some of you may be looking it up and find which it is. I didn't see it. I thought this was interesting, though. They had a 3-tiered pillar that's worth noting, because I do think it's actually notionally a good idea. One was prevention, and here prevention specifically preventing all forms and manifestations of anti-Semitism and taking all action towards that end. The second is the protection of Jewish life, of practice of one's religion, all elements related to Jewish life. And then the promotion of Jewish life. That was the third pillar in this case. Here, the issue especially of education in this regard. They then divided that down into 3 parts. Overall strategies, and also taking into account what you said, Europe is not monolithic. And even the EU is not monolithic. I think you have to recognize that. But here they came together in support of this for specifically setting up an international Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And that was part of an overall strategy here. The concept that one must remember and one must act in this case. So they had an overall strategy for preventing and also especially curbing anti-Semitism, all manifestations, whether in person or online. Funding. They highlighted the action of funding, that there has to be funding to prevent any kind of manifestation in public spaces and places of worship. And then support for organizations. That was a third component here, and where they also, in this regard, felt that they should set up a kind of European research on not just only the scale and the scope of anti-Semitism, looking at what the data is, ensuring that the public knows the data, but also a remembrance of the Holocaust. I only mention this to you because, as I said, I did not know this, but I thought on this panel, since it does say why EU matters, I thought it was worth mentioning this. But it's a statement in itself that we don't know it. And I will also say this to you, that then I looked at, and this is my third point, and then I'm going to go to my fourth, which is your challenge. The third point is, after having read that, I also looked at the data specific to Europe. And quite honestly, when I look at all the surveys that are done by a myriad of organizations, the answer is that anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe. So then you have to ask the question, well, why is that? Here you have this action that's been taken specifically, but yet it doesn't equate with the rise of anti-Semitism. And by the way, as I say that broadly, because a point that Joan, if I may call you Joan, made, which I think was significant, again, it's not monolithic. Different countries pursue different laws and governments have different actions. But if you look at it, there are some where we know if I could say that we've witnessed in the past years, we've seen defamation and very strong anti-Semitic behavior in France, for example, that's been played out in the news, as well as in Germany, for example. Austria has been another country when you look at the data. I can go on in this case. So let me come to, and by the way, there's also in some country the rise of what are known as neo-Nazi parties, by the way. So here, the good intention has not exactly matched up with the country-by-country action on the ground. I'd like to go to your question and then close by putting forward what I'd say as action. I'm actually with you, on the ICC. And the reason why I am with Gol on the ICC, I used to work in the Human Rights Bureau in the State Department. And time and again, and not just on this issue, we have not really seen where declarations from the ICC match up with concrete, tangible action. Significantly, the way, and I was in the Reagan administration, we approached it, which is slightly different from what you said, is we looked at where the ICC actually did take action that had tangible results. In other words, not a broad support for ICC work, but looking at it on a regional and targeted basis. And an example was that Joan gave, which, by the way, I was very involved in, the Balkans, where, by the way, there were those criminals in the Balkans who were brought into The Hague. They were tried and they were imprisoned. There was actual tangible action. So in this case, the approach we took was on a case-by-case basis. But I think you will argue that here we haven't seen it match up with concrete results in this case. So my response would be support for that, maybe in a regional basis, if we actually saw targeted results. On the second part, I'd say this. I think Joan makes a compelling point. I've said it 3 times, this is maybe my 4th time, about Europe is not monolithic. And I want to give an example. A country that I have visited and where there's a cemetery devoted to those who died during World War II and the Holocaust in the center of town is Prague. I don't know how many of you have visited Prague, but it's actually very gripping being there. The Czech government has made it its strong business to be aligned with Israel. It has a very strong relationship. But there are other countries, if we discussed, that do not. And you mentioned the support for Palestinians. So in this regard, I'd say this. I think that one should look at and align oneself with those countries that really have concrete records that you can support and align with, and not necessarily look at the EU as a whole. And by the way, there are many countries in Europe have said they not always welcome the policies of the EU, that it doesn't take into account differences. So that would be my variation. And in conclusion, I want to go back to the Anti-Defamation League. I do think that we should define this as global. Anti-Semitism is a global emergency. It needs to be defined as such, and we need to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and ensure that that gets out everywhere. First base is making sure that people know the state of the problem and act on it.
I love it. I think I'm completely with you. I had the honor of meeting President Herzog just recently and presenting my book to him. And this was right after he came back from the UN, where he said exactly what you were saying. He said, this is a wake-up call to humanity, and we have to treat it as such. And it's not being treated right now as such. And if we treat it as a wake-up call to humanity, then we can come up with unusual frameworks like what we've just discussed about the ICC. I think we can actually, in many respects, don't disagree as much about the ICC.
May I mention one other thing, and I apologize, just a quick one. you know what it also said? We don't have a real strategy, that we divide pieces up. And that was another point. I'm not referring now to the EU inter-alliance. This is the Anti-Defamation League said that it's absolutely essential that there is not only a call for this and calling it a global emergency, but actually having a very specific strategy.
Absolutely. And by the way, the administration, President Trump did mandate agencies to come up with a plan in the next 60 days to counter anti-Semitism. And I think part of the strategy is Rabbi, having this conference right now is certainly part of it. But on the ICC, we're not saying things that are so different. So, Joan, I understand that you don't want to close the ICC because they do positive work, and I agree with that. But let's face it, the ICC's core business has become assaulting the Jewish state. They have a side business of going after war criminals. But it's not like they've chosen, like they looked, what is the worst war crimes and chose Israel? I mean, it's the other way around. So by getting what I suggested, an enforceable pledge, and the EU can be a force in that, an enforceable pledge from those countries that are needed to cooperate. The ICC doesn't have its own powers. They can invade countries. They need other countries like France, to use the example. If the President Trump can get an enforceable pledge from France that they will not cooperate ever by passing a law or whatever the mechanism is, both of you are in government, I'm not, so you know what the enforcement mechanism could be, that they will never do this relative to the United States and relative to the Jewish state. And the reason that we always single Israel out in the negative, here I'm offering to single Israel out in the positive because that's the party that's been attacked. The ICC attacked Israel. So after World War II, when Germany attacked the Jews, then there were certain restrictions on Germany's ability. They didn't have their full sovereignty. They couldn't have a military. So that's what. So if we get the pledge from countries around the world not to cooperate, not just the ICC, any sorts of origins of lawfare against the Jewish state or the United States, then the ICC can go about its core business.
I support your pledge. I didn't say that, but to be clear, I think the concept of such a pledge is a tangible way of dividing who is really and wants to combat this. As I said, ICC, we never viewed it as effective. I only cited that one case that I can think of where honestly there was, some action. So, but your bottom line was a pledge. But I'm going to add one before Joan jumps in. And that is, we're not talking about, we have why the EU, but let me mention another institution where there is outright, I will say, bias and prejudice, is the UN. As I said, I worked on human rights. Yes. Any of you may know, do you know how many resolutions, are in the United Nations and UN Human Rights Council, not against egregious human rights violations, but against Israel and saying Zionism is racism. I mean, close to like 55, 60 resolutions. It's nonstop and it's outrageous. And in that case, I want to add that to your list.
I just can't see that a pledge of itself is enforceable. As soon as it doesn't suit someone, they opt out anyway of a pledge such as that. I would think there's no reason you can't look at other means of reform, whether it's case by case or regional. I don't think the fact that you've got a body is what's wrong. It's the people who are working in that body. So if you think about the ICJ, you've got the lawyer Karim Khan, and he is so obviously biased, and he's a British lawyer. And then you have people like Vice Chair Sebatunde from Uganda, who is so obviously really brave and wouldn't support and let the motion, the advisory motion, be unanimous.
Let's get Elon Musk to get into the ICC and the ICJ.
She wouldn't support the ICJ motion that Israel was committing genocide. She prevented it being unanimous. She was really brave. So I think it's what we've got to do is broader than what you're talking about. I understand why you want to target those organisations, but I think we need something a lot more. a lot more action. And I think the IRA that you're talking about, the strategy, the plan from the EU is fantastic. However, it's all about implementation at the end of the day. It's not enough to have something written on paper. Now, different countries are doing different things, but let me just tell you two things that I think are really important. In recent weeks, Keir Starmer, who's the Prime Minister in the UK, as you know, who we don't agree with everything he's done, do we? But we do agree with putting those planes in the air. I also agree with something he said recently. He said he wants to see, and he's willing to take action, so we'll judge it on outcomes. He wants to take action to ensure that Holocaust education is core curriculum in all our schools, and not just as a module in year 5, or though that's important, at least it's something, but that it actually runs throughout a child's school career. Now, I think that is a really important act, because there's a survey similar to the evidence you're giving, Ambassador. There's a survey out that shows that in the UK, 1 in 3 young people, 1 in 3, think that the Israelis treat the Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews. If that isn't a call to action for all of us, I don't know what is. So I welcome what Keir Starmer said, and I want to see that implemented. And the other thing he said that I think is important in characterising him as a Prime Minister, because you are never going to find a politician, I doubt, or government that you agree with everything that they say or do. And there's things he does that we don't agree with. But I just want to point out, he is not Jeremy Corbyn, the man who led the British Labour Party, led them into being engulfed by a crisis of anti-Semitism that we saw after the 7th of October had seeped into the wider society. That's the pernicious legacy of those kind of toxic politics. What Keir Starmer said at the dispatch box when asked by another MP who was clearly, in my view, anti-Israel, about genocide and the behaviour of Israel in prosecuting the war following October the 7th, he said, I know what the definition of genocide is, and that's why I don't use it in this case. And if you want to talk about genocide, let's start with October the 7th. And I applaud that. And although I don't agree with everything that the current Labour government does, I think fundamentally they are friends of Israel. And our job as ELNET is to make sure that they don't just stay friends, but that we do what I said. We strengthen that relationship. We build a community of pro-Israel politicians, cross-party, we're unique in that, in the UK and right across Europe, which is our other unique feature. We work right across Europe and bring politicians together. We take them to Israel. I went to Israel in 1998. Well, I'd been in Parliament a year. I know the impact going on a delegation to Israel has. It's huge. And the other reason why I know Holocaust education works is because in the 1980s, I worked with the Imperial War Museum interviewing civilians involved in 20th century conflict. And I started the project of interviewing what was then referred to as concentration camp survivors. I interviewed survivors from Buchenwald, Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, people who'd been on forced marches, Jewish people who'd been in ghettos, and it was an education, and it stayed with me, and I know what the cost of anti-Semitism is because of that. So putting that into our core curriculum, that would be my action.
That's so important. And I want to end, since the time is almost over, by it seems like we disagreed. We sort of like, got to a common ground of sorts of the ICC or some frameworks.
Very good.
Well, on the Europe thing, we don't exactly. We don't really disagree. So I want to restate and agree really with what you said. So I said it is really important, in my view, as a policy objective for the Trump administration to demand that Europe gets completely out of Israeli-Palestinian affair, both in funding organization. I mean, all the thing that Elon Musk is doing in the funding, U.S. aid program that inside Palestinians are meaningless, where they're dropping the bucket relative to all the money that Europe is pouring. But more so when it comes to the political environment. I mean, they should not be part of the quartet. Why? Should we, Israel, be part of the Muslim-European conflict and human rights, violation of human rights, Muslims' human rights in Europe? But my suggestion is not to dump Europe. Europe is very important. I'm a Europhile. I love Europe, and I've spent an enormous amount of time in Europe. And I'm friends with, starting with people, who work in the EU,
And you'll always be welcome.
Thank you. But I am saying let's liberate Europe from this notion that they must be involved in this conflict. Rather than focus on Israeli-Palestinian conflict first, focus on Europe first. There's a lot of issues in Europe, and, as you said, Israel can help them. There's a lot of light emanating from Zion. And rather than oppose this light, it's time for Europe to benefit from this light, exactly as our Arab friends are doing, and follow their lead. So I'm not saying, I'm saying the Israeli-European and American-European best days are ahead. But a condition for that is that Europe and its disruptive intervention in Israeli-Palestinian affairs.
Why should America have involvement then rather than anyone else? Or why should Russia? The tropes that the Israelis are like the Nazis in the way they treat.
I'm not talking about some justice.
They came from Russia in the Cold War.
You in Europe, not you, but Europe in general.
Good people and work together to build a good international.
Europe was in charge of the world for 2,000 years almost. And Europeans have not come to terms with the fact that over the last 100 years, there's been a shift of power from Europe to the United States. So why should the United States be involved in peacemaking and not Europe? Because you've tried it. You're not you specifically, but Europe. And you just
we don't live in the past, though, do we?
Okay, so let's do the present. As we speak, there is money going into NGOs that incite Palestinians against Israelis. And, there are new frameworks that are offered, by this administration. And look, at the end, it's not nice to say this. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of love and shared values between Europe, Israel, and the United States. But the United States and Europe are a byproduct of two contradicting revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I mean, the American Revolution, is about, one nation under God.
Well, my parents are Irish, and they were under British rule for 700 years. And sadly, Ireland has a culture that I think is anti-Semitic. But the fact that Ireland was under British rule for 700 years doesn't make me say, so that was the past and therefore the UK shouldn't be involved. I think Europe, you've got to build a world of strategic alliances based on good values and put the right individuals in place to operate them. You can't wipe out a whole continent.
I want to thank our panelists. We are fortunately out of time. Thank you so much for being here. We have a small gift for you. And for all those here, we're going to take a